The asphalt ribbon, long and scarred, finally surrendered to the cracked, familiar sign, Oakhaven. My breath caught a cold, metallic tang in the air that seemed to have been waiting for my return. The last time I'd driven this road, the world had still possessed its sharp edges, its vibrant, dissonant hum. Now, a peculiar stillness draped itself over the landscape, muffling the usual rustle of the coastal pines, absorbing the distant murmur of the churning ocean. It felt less like arriving and more like sinking. Oakhaven had always been a place suspended, a pocket of forgotten time clinging to the rugged coastline. But this was different. The houses, weathered gray and salt-bleached, seemed to shrink further into themselves, their windows like vacant eyes. No children's laughter spilled from the overgrown yards, no distant clatter of tools from the boatyard. Even the gulls, usually raucous and demanding, wheeled overhead in unnerving silence, their cries swallowed by the heavy air. A fine mist, tasting of brine and decay, had begun to crawl inland, blurring the already muted palette of the town. Each turn revealed another tableau of quiet desolation, a fishing net draped over a porch rail, motionless, a single, faded flag hanging limp from a pole, a storefront window displaying goods that looked as if they'd been untouched for decades. My grandmother's cryptic death, a brief, sterile note from the town's administrator about a sudden, peaceful passing, had pulled me back. But peace was the last thing I felt here. It was the feeling of being watched, a subtle prickle at the nape of my neck that intensified with every silent house I passed. Nothing. Yet the impression persisted, a faint, unseen pressure against my awareness, like the distant thrum of a silent bell. The main street, usually a modest hub of activity, was utterly deserted. The general store's door was shut, its painted sign peeling like sunburnt skin. Where were they? The townsfolk, the familiar, if sometimes gruff, faces I remembered from childhood visits? I needed to park, to step out into this unsettling quiet. Spotting a low, concrete structure partially obscured by the mist, I turned the wheel, guiding my vehicle into the entrance of a foggy parking garage where footsteps echoed too long. My headlights cut through the swirling vapor, illuminating empty spaces, rows of silent pillars, and a single, ancient sedan tucked away in a corner, its paint faded to the color of bone. I killed the engine. The sudden absence of its rumble was deafening. I unlapped my seatbelt, the click echoing with an unnatural clarity. My boots hit the concrete floor, a dull thud that seemed to travel down the length of the garage, bouncing off walls, lingering in the stagnant air long after the sound should have dissipated. It was as if the space itself held onto every vibration, reluctant to let them go. My grandmother's house was a short walk from here, just beyond the old town square. I grabbed my bag, the weight of it a small, comforting anchor in the pervasive strangeness. Stepping out of the garage, the mist had thickened, now a soft, gray blanket muffling the world. I pulled my jacket tighter. The first person I saw was a man standing by the empty town square's gazebo. He was old, his face a road map of deep creases, a faded fisherman's cap pulled low over his eyes. I recognized him, or thought I did. He was the old dockmaster, a man whose booming laugh had once been a staple of Oakhaven. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice sounding thin against the vast quiet. "Is everything all right? The town seems different." He turned slowly, his movement stiff, almost mechanical. His eyes, when they met mine, were a pale, washed-out blue, like stones at the bottom of a shallow tide pool. There was no recognition there, no flicker of the gruff warmth I remembered. His gaze seemed to pass through me, focusing on something distant, something unseen beyond my shoulder. Oakhaven is. Oakhaven. Always has been. He spoke the words with a flat, unwavering cadence, as if reciting a long memorized phrase. There was no inflection, no curiosity, no genuine engagement. A knot tightened in my stomach. "I'm Cole," I offered, a desperate attempt to bridge the gulf. "My grandmother, Ilara. I'm here for the funeral." A momentary pause, almost imperceptible. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor passed through his expression, like a ripple on still water, then vanished. His eyes remained empty. "Ilara," he repeated, the name flat, without memory. "Yes. The passing." He gestured vaguely towards the mist-shrouded steeple of the old church. "The gathering is soon." He offered no condolences, no familiar anecdote about my grandmother, no spark of shared history. His gaze drifted away again, fixed on the swirling fog, as if waiting for a cue. It was unsettling, this utter lack of human connection, this vacant politeness. It was as if a vital spark had been extinguished within him, leaving behind only the shell of a man. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger now, no longer a subtle prickle but a distinct pressure, as if unseen eyes were observing my every reaction, every shift in my uneasy posture. The air grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension, a silent question that Oakhaven seemed to ask of me, and I, in turn, began to ask of it. The funeral was a whisper, not a wail. The air in the small Oakhaven chapel, thick with the scent of lilies and damp earth, pressed down on my chest like a physical weight. The few faces gathered were familiar, yet distant, their features softened by the dim light filtering through stained glass panes that depicted scenes of an agrarian past, bountiful harvests, sturdy farmers, none of the stark emptiness I felt. I searched for a flicker of genuine sorrow, a shared glance of remembrance for my grandmother, but found only polite, almost vacant, solemnity. After the short, strangely impersonal service, where the preacher spoke in generalized platitudes that could have applied to any deceased villager, I gravitated towards an old-school friend, a man whose laugh I once knew as well as my own heartbeat. His name, a sound that used to conjure images of scraped knees and shared secrets, now felt like a foreign word on my tongue. "It's Cole," I offered, extending a hand. "From school." He nodded, a slow, almost mechanical gesture. His eyes, once bright with mischief, were now clouded, like stones at the bottom of a murky pond. "Yes, Cole. Of course." He squeezed my hand, but the warmth I remembered was absent. "Sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I said, trying to infuse my voice with the warmth I craved. "It's good to see you. I remember that summer, when Grandma caught us trying to fish in Miller's Pond with her best china teacups. He was furious, but then she just laughed. I waited for the shared smile, the knowing nod. His brow furrowed slightly, a shallow line that quickly smoothed away. "Miller's Pond, yes. A fine fishing spot." He paused, his gaze drifting over my shoulder to the ornate crucifix on the wall. "Your grandmother. He was a kind woman. Always had a word for everyone." He offered no specifics, no echo of the teacups, no hint of shared mischief. It was as if he was reciting from a script, a generic eulogy for a stranger. The details, the vibrant hues of our past, seemed to have bled from his mind, leaving only a faded outline. I tried again, later, at the small gathering in the community hall. The tea was weak, the biscuits stale. I approached an older woman, a distant relative whose home I'd visited often as a child. His face was a map of wrinkles, each one a testament to years lived, but his eyes held a disquieting youthfulness, as if the experiences that etched his skin hadn't quite reached his core. "Aunt Eleanor," I began, my voice softer now, tentative. "It's Cole. I wanted to ask about Grandma. Do you remember when she taught me to bake those terrible, lopsided apple pies for the autumn fair? She always said mine tasted best, even if they looked like a dog's breakfast." Aunt Eleanor smiled, a thin, almost brittle expression. "Oh, your grandmother. A wonderful baker, wasn't she? Her apple pies were legendary in Oakhaven." Again, the generic praise, the absence of personal color. She didn't remember the lopsided pies, the laughter, the flour dusting my small, eager hands. She just remembered the fact of her baking, stripped of its essence. He was always so good with the children. Always had a story for them. I pressed further, a cold tendril of unease tightening around my chest. "Do you remember when I left Oakhaven? The farewell party she threw for me, with the terrible band and the sparklers?" Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes, those strangely young eyes, seemed to glaze over for a fraction of a second. "You left, dear?" "Yes, I suppose you did. Young people do, don't they? To find their way in the world." There was no recognition of the party, no specific memory of my departure. It was as if the last 2 decades of my life, my absence from Oakhaven, had simply dissolved into a vague societal truism. A peculiar, muted amnesia seemed to hang over Oakhaven, a shared forgetfulness that was more unsettling than outright denial. My own mind, once a fortress of vivid recollections, began to feel permeable, vulnerable. Was I the one misremembering? Had my absence from Oakhaven somehow distorted my past, made my memories more colorful, more real than they ever truly were? The thick mist, an omnipresent shroud in Oakhaven, coiled around the parked vehicles, obscuring details, making solid objects seem like suggestions. My breath plumed before me, a fleeting ghost. The encounters in the hall replayed in my mind, the vague platitudes, the shifting eyes, the utter lack of specific, shared history. It wasn't just my grandmother's memory that was fractured, it was the entire town's. They remembered the existence of events, but not their texture, their sound, their taste, their emotional weight. It was like they were living through a collective dream, where the narrative was present but the sensory richness had been leached away. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old photos, my grandmother, beaming, holding up one of my lopsided pies, the terrible band at my farewell party, sparklers fizzing around us. These weren't figments of my imagination. These were real, tangible proofs of a past that Oakhaven seemed to have collectively forgotten. My fingers trembled slightly as I tucked the phone away. And I, Cole, was the only one who seemed to notice the quiet erasure. A fierce, desperate determination began to bloom in my chest, a desperate need to understand what force was consuming the town's very essence. Her smile, that brittle, unchanging thing, still clung to my mind like a burr. The woman's eyes had held a vast, empty expanse, an ocean of forgotten moments. It was not just her, the other townsfolk I'd encountered, their gazes had flickered with the same unsettling blankness, a collective amnesia that seemed to ripple through Oakhaven's very air. My grandmother's cryptic death, the reason for my return, felt less like an ending and more like a gateway to a question I was ill-equipped to answer. The first order of business, a grim duty, was to begin sifting through her belongings. The house, perched on a rise overlooking the sullen gray of the bay, had always been a fortress of silence. My grandmother's old sedan, a relic of polished chrome and faded paint, had been towed there after the incident. The air in the garage was thick with the metallic tang of exhaust and the damp, earthy scent of concrete. Each click of my shoes against the oil-stained floor tiles stretched into an unnaturally long reverberation, as if the sound itself were hesitant to fade. The fog, a perpetual resident of this place, softened the edges of everything, blurring the hulking forms of parked vehicles into indistinct shadows. I navigated the labyrinthine rows, the fluorescent lights humming sickly above, their pallid glow struggling to pierce the mist. My grandmother's sedan sat in a corner, draped in a thin layer of grime, a forgotten sentinel. The car's interior smelled faintly of lavender and dust, a scent that pricked a memory of childhood visits, warm cookies, a stern but loving hand. I fumbled with the latch, the glove compartment groaning open like a tired sigh. Among a tangle of old receipts and a dried-up pen, my fingers brushed against a slim, leather-bound volume. It was not a journal, not in the traditional sense, but more of a ledger, its cover worn smooth by countless touches. The official had mentioned only keys. A prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. Back in the hushed solemnity of my grandmother's living room, the journal felt heavy in my hands. The house, usually so full of the ghosts of childhood, now felt merely empty, save for the hum of the old refrigerator and the persistent creak of the floorboards above. I settled into her armchair, the velvet cushion still holding the faint impression of her form, and opened the book. The first few pages were neat, precise, filled with entries detailing local weather patterns, garden observations, and mundane household expenses. Then, gradually, a shift began. The handwriting grew less steady, the lines wandering. Dates became sporadic, sometimes jumping weeks, then days, then hours within the same scrawl. A soft erosion. Further in, the script became a frantic spiderweb, interspersed with crude, unsettling symbols I didn't recognize, interlocking circles, lines radiating from a central point, a jagged, eye-like shape repeated over and over. They looked less like a language and more like a desperate attempt to capture a nightmare. They forget the storm of '78. The old oak on Miller's Lane. The name of the baker's boy who drowned in the creek. It's not just details, it's the shape of their lives. A slow, quiet unraveling. The forgetting. My breath hitched. This was it. This was the explanation for the blank stares, the fractured memories I'd witnessed. My grandmother had seen it, documented it, perhaps even fought against it. Oakhaven. My family, we are keepers. Or perhaps, merely witnesses. The pact. The ancient one stirs. It feeds. It hungers for memory, for history, for the very fabric of being. The words blurred before my eyes. A pact? My family's role? This wasn't just about a town losing its mind, it was about something primal, something vast and malevolent, lurking beneath the soil of Oakhaven. And my grandmother, in her final, desperate act, had left me the map to its awakening. I would not let Oakhaven be forgotten. And my family. My family was bound to this horror. The journal, heavy in my hands, seemed to pulse with a cold, ancient rhythm, a counterpoint to the frantic beating in my own chest. A pact, etched in faded ink, spoke of generations guarding a silence, feeding a hunger. The words blurred, not from fatigue, but from a sudden, visceral revulsion. Oakhaven wasn't just sick, it was a sacrifice. She hadn't been losing her mind, he had been trying to warn me, trying to break free from a promise made by the dead. I closed the journal, the leather cool beneath my clammy fingers, and placed it on the small table. It seemed to thicken, pressing in from the corners of the room, heavy and expectant. Then, it happened. I spun, scanning the empty hallway, the closed doors. Nothing. Just the settling of old wood, the sigh of the wind through the eaves. The next few days were a slow, agonizing unraveling. They were like static on an old radio, always present, always threatening to coalesce into something intelligible. A fleeting distortion in the periphery, a deepening of the gloom that vanished the moment I turned my head. It was never a shape, never a figure, just an absence of light that moved with an unnatural swiftness. The town itself seemed to mirror my internal disquiet. I remembered its proprietor, a woman with flour always clinging to her apron, who had offered me a warm pastry just days before I found the journal. Now, it was simply gone. Later, at the general store, I asked the young clerk about it. Her gaze was blank. Uncomprehending. The bakery, you mean? There hasn't been a bakery here in years, Cole. It wasn't that he was lying, it was that the memory had simply ceased to exist for her. The pattern repeated. A familiar face, a grizzled old fisherman who always sat by the docks, his boat now conspicuously absent from its mooring. When I inquired, the dock master simply shrugged. Never was a fisherman named that, Cole. I found myself navigating the narrow, winding lanes that led to the town's industrial periphery, towards the concrete maw of a vast, forgotten structure. I had no reason to be there, no memory of why I'd parked my vehicle there, yet I felt compelled to descend into its depths. They weren't speaking words I could understand, but their presence was undeniable, a swarm of hungry insects buzzing just behind my ears. I reached the second subterranean level, the fog here so thick it swallowed the weak yellow glow of the infrequent overhead lamps, turning them into sickly halos. And then, I saw it. It was taller than a person, slender and indistinct, like a column of smoke that had momentarily solidified. It didn't move towards me, but rather seemed to observe me, a silent, predatory gaze I could feel even without seeing any eyes. The concrete floor felt like it vibrated beneath my feet, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to rise from the very earth. This wasn't just a trick of the light, or a figment of my stress-addled mind. This was real. This was the entity, its tendrils reaching, its hunger growing, not just for memories, but for the very essence of those who held them. The missing baker, the forgotten fisherman, they weren't just forgotten, they were taken. Oakhaven was not just losing its mind, it was losing its people, one by one, to the silent consciousness beneath. And I, Cole, was now squarely in its sights. The journal, a heavy, leather-bound testament to generations of unspoken horror, lay on the passenger seat, its faded ink a roadmap to my family's complicity. A pact, it had whispered, etched in a hand eerily similar to my grandmother's, spoke of silence and hunger. My chest still thrummed with a frantic, cold rhythm, a counterpoint to the ancient pulse I imagined emanating from the book itself. The words had blurred, not from fatigue, but from the sheer, suffocating weight of their implication. My first destination, scribbled almost illegibly in the journal's margins, was the old mill. A place I vaguely remembered from childhood stories, always spoken of with a hushed reverence or a superstitious shudder. A place long abandoned, left to the creeping embrace of the forest. The mist, smelling faintly of mildew and forgotten oil, swirled around my ankles, obscuring the precise distance to the grimy pillars, making the space feel infinitely larger and more desolate than it was. I felt a strange, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind that suggests unseen eyes, a silent witness in the shifting vapor. My hand, slick with a clammy sweat, fumbled for the car door handle, eager to escape the unnerving quiet. The drive out of Oakhaven was a study in deepening isolation. The road, once paved, fractured into a patchwork of crumbling asphalt and gravel, forcing me to slow, each jolt rattling not just the car, but something deeper within me. No other cars passed, no distant lights flickered. It was as if Oakhaven itself had exhaled, leaving me suspended in a vacuum of memory and mist. Finally, a break in the trees revealed it, the old mill. It stood like a skeletal sentinel, a hulking silhouette against the gray canvas of the afternoon. The roof sagged in places, a testament to decades of neglect and the relentless gnawing of time. A tall, brick chimney, cracked and crumbling, pierced the sky like a broken finger. A faint, metallic tang, mixed with the damp scent of decay and something else, something cloying and ancient, reached me even before I cut the engine. The air here was heavy, thick with the weight of forgotten industry and a deeper, more profound stillness. I stepped out, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots, the sound shockingly intrusive in the profound quiet. The wind, if there was any, was hushed, merely a sigh through the skeletal remains of the mill structure. I moved towards the main entrance, a cavernous opening where a heavy, rusted door hung askew on a single hinge. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a vast, cathedral-like space. Massive, silent gears, their teeth corroded and black, rose like petrified beasts from the concrete floor. Shafts of machinery, thick with grime and cobwebs, stretched towards the unseen ceiling. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming, a monument to a forgotten purpose. Dust motes danced in the feeble light, creating a shimmering, ethereal haze. Every creak of the old structure, every drip of water from the unseen roof, was magnified, echoing like a sigh from the past. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing back at me, a lonely rhythm in the vast emptiness. My eyes scanned the walls, the floor, the bases of the machinery, searching for anything, any mark that might resonate with the strange symbols in the journal. Beneath layers of grime and clinging moss, on a rough-hewn stone foundation block, were carvings. Not simple graffiti, but deliberate, deeply incised symbols. These were the same symbols, the very patterns, etched into the brittle pages of my grandmother's journal. My fingers, trembling slightly, ran over the cold stone, tracing the unfamiliar forms. The stone felt strangely warm beneath the grime, almost as if it pulsed with a faint, internal heat. As I followed the lines, my gaze drifted lower, towards the base of the foundation. There, partially obscured by a tumble of fallen bricks and what looked like an ancient, rusted lever, was a seam. A perfect, almost invisible line in the stone, unlike the rough, uneven mortar around it. I knelt, pushing away the debris, and saw it, a heavy, iron-bound door, set flush into the stone, its surface pitted and scarred by time. There was no handle, only a faint circular indentation that seemed to correspond with one of the more prominent symbols carved above. A profound silence descended, heavier than anything I had experienced so far. The mill, which had been merely echoing, now seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't just a hidden chamber, this was an entrance. An entrance to something deeper, something that the journal hinted at, something ancient and hungry. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden, absolute quiet. But beneath the fear, a steel thread of resolve tightened. I had come this far. I clutched the steering wheel, my knuckles stark white against the dark plastic, the engine long since dead. The low hum of distant machinery, or perhaps just the town settling into its unnatural slumber, vibrated through the very floor beneath my worn boots. It was a place designed to swallow sound, to stretch a single click or scrape into an unnerving symphony of uncertainty. The journal had led me here, to the deepest level of this forgotten structure, to a section marked only by a faded, hand-painted symbol on a crumbling pillar. It was a symbol I now recognized from the ancient script within the book's brittle pages, a spiraling knot, twisting inward upon itself, a glyph of consumption. It was the entrance. This was the source, the festering heart of Oakhaven's affliction. My boots found a narrow, uneven ledge, then a series of rough-hewn steps carved directly into the bedrock. The descent was immediate, steep, and absolute. The walls of the passage were not smooth, engineered concrete, but raw, unforgiving rock, slick with condensation. Each step I took sent a cascade of fine, damp earth tumbling into the unseen depths below, the sound swallowed almost instantly. The tunnel twisted, a serpentine coil delving deeper into the earth, and the temperature dropped sharply, the air growing thick and still, muffling even my own ragged breaths. My beam caught fleeting glimpses of crude carvings on the rock face, more of the spiraling knot, repeated in various sizes, sometimes interwoven with stick figures, their limbs distorted, their heads featureless ovals. I pressed on, my heart a frantic flutter against my ribs, the rhythmic drip of unseen water somewhere ahead the only sound to break the terrifying stillness. The passage widened abruptly, opening into a vast, cavernous chamber. My flashlight, even on its brightest setting, struggled to pierce the enormity of the space. It was a cathedral of stone, its ceiling lost to the absolute blackness above. Everywhere, bones. Not neatly interred, but scattered, heaped, and sometimes, horrifyingly, arranged. Ribs formed macabre circles, vertebrae stacked into totems, skulls turned to face a central, unseen point. They were old, brittle, some appearing human, others undeniably animal, a grotesque mosaic of sacrifice and forgotten life. In the very center of the space, rooted to the damp earth, stood an obscenity. It was a growth, organic and alien, unlike anything I had ever witnessed. It pulsed. A dull, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the soles of my boots, a sound that seemed to originate from within the very rock itself. Its surface was slick, glistening with a viscous, clear fluid, reflecting my flashlight beam with a sickening sheen. From its uppermost curve, translucent filaments, fine as spider silk but thicker, tougher, stretched upwards into the unseen ceiling, disappearing into the black. A low, wet sucking sound accompanied each pulse, a sound of something vast and hungry drawing sustenance. The sweet, cloying odor I'd first detected at the grate was strongest here, mixed with a faint, metallic tang, like old pennies. This was it. The manifestation. The thing that fed. The journal's cryptic words, the town's fractured memories, my grandmother's death, it all coalesced into this monstrous, undeniable reality. It was a feeder, a silent, ravenous maw at the heart of the earth, drawing something vital from the town above. I needed to move, to press against the suffocating weight of discovery. The journal's final entry had hinted at a place, a deep maw beneath the town, where the offerings were made. I killed the engine, plunging the interior into a sudden, deeper quiet, broken only by the settling ticks of cooling metal. The air thickened further as I moved, a spectral curtain descending. The fog here was not a natural mist, but a dense, cloying vapor that clung to every surface, blurring the concrete pillars into indistinct monoliths. The sound stretched, drawn out, as if the very air held onto the vibrations, unwilling to let them dissipate. Water dripped somewhere unseen, a rhythmic, maddening patter that seemed to mark the passage of time in an alien cadence. It was a low thrum, not mechanical, but organic, like the distant pulse of something vast and deeply rooted. I moved deeper into the garage's lower levels, past vacant, dust-coated parking spaces, the air growing heavier, denser, pressing in on me. The concrete ramp sloped downwards, steeper than I remembered, descending into a gloom so profound it seemed to drink the light. The air grew thick with the smell of whetstone and something else, a sweet, earthy musk, like overturned soil mixed with the faint, unsettling tang of ozone. The echoes of my footsteps were now muffled, absorbed by the encroaching earth, replaced by a low, humming vibration that resonated deep within my chest. Then, the cavern opened. It was not a grand, cathedral-like space, but a vast, irregular chamber, its ceiling lost in the perpetual gloom, its walls rough-hewn and glistening. And within it, the townsfolk. They stood in a loose, sprawling circle, dozens of them, scattered across the uneven floor of the cavern. The former teacher, her usually stern face slack, stood beside the quiet baker, his hands, usually dusted with flour, hanging limp at his sides. The hardware store owner, the young woman who worked at the library, even a few faces I didn't recognize but knew belonged to Oakhaven's fabric, all of them were here. They were unmoving, their bodies still, there. Gazes fixed on nothing I could discern, their eyes wide and vacant, reflecting the faint, phosphorescent glow that emanated from fissures in the cavern walls. A low, collective murmur filled the space, a sound that was not quite speech, not quite a sigh, but an amalgamation of both. I saw a ripple pass through the group, a shared tremor, as if a single, invisible thread connected each of them. Their individual memories, their unique experiences, were not being spoken, but shared, broadcast and received by every other soul in the chamber. My breath hitched. This was the offerings my grandmother's journal had described. They were unknowingly feeding the entity, their consciousnesses dissolving, fragmenting, becoming threads in a vast, silent tapestry. They were no longer individuals, but echoes, components of a burgeoning, unified mind. Surrender the burden of self. Let go of your pain, your fear, your isolation. My own memories, sharp and distinct moments, my grandmother's stern smile, the scent of the old house, the fear gripping me now, felt suddenly heavy, cumbersome. What if I could shed them? A profound peace, a sense of belonging I had never truly known, seemed to emanate from the collective, beckoning me. My feet ached to move, to step forward, to close the distance and dissolve into the hum. No. The journal's words screamed in my mind, a legacy of surrender. This was not peace, it was erasure. My hand tightened on the leather-bound journal, its sharp corner digging into my palm, a small, grounding pain. I was cold. I remembered. Not yet. But the pull was growing stronger, a siren song in the depths, threatening to drown out my resolve. The vacant faces were a mirror, reflecting back a stillness I felt myself desiring, a profound, tempting quiet. My grandmother's stern smile, the scent of the old house, these vivid fragments of a life I cherished suddenly seemed like unnecessary noise, a cacophony I could simply choose to silence. But then, a jarring discord. It was the same smell that clung to the damp walls of the tunnels, the one that had haunted my grandmother's cellar. It was the smell of this place, a signature of the consuming entity, not of the peace it offered. And with it, a flash, my grandmother, not smiling, but her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire as she clutched a worn leather-bound journal, her lips moving in a silent, furious incantation. Her defiance, her singular, unyielding will, slammed into me like a physical blow. No. Not peace. Erasure. The realization ripped through the seductive haze. This wasn't release, it was oblivion. This was not shedding burdens, but becoming nothing. The horror of it clawed at my throat. I thrashed, a desperate, internal struggle against the magnetic draw that still sought to claim me. I forced my gaze away from the blank, receptive faces, away from the shimmering, almost visible hum of their collective presence. My breath hitched, a raw gasp tearing from my lungs. I stumbled backward, away from the encroaching circle, my feet slipping on the slick, cold stone of the underground passage. I turned and ran, blindly scrambling back through the labyrinthine tunnels. It wasn't about killing, it was about consuming. It wasn't about ending life, but about erasing identity, assimilating every unique thought, every cherished memory, every singular soul into its vast, silent consciousness. The townsfolk weren't dead, they were simply gone, absorbed into a collective non-existence. A fate far more terrifying than any grave. I didn't know how long I ran, or how many turns I took. The tunnels twisted and branched, a dizzying maze. I felt a constant, subtle vibration beneath my feet, the entity's unseen pulse. Each echo of my footsteps seemed to hang in the air for too long, as if waiting for another sound to join it. I pushed through a narrow, crumbling archway, then another, until I saw it, a faint, milky glow ahead. Not the deep, pulsing luminescence of the entity, but the pale, diffused light of the outside world. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of exhaust fumes and standing water, a stark contrast to the subterranean musk. The fog was a living thing, swirling around the concrete pillars, obscuring the rows of parked vehicles into indistinct hulks. My own breath plumed before me, a ghost in the humid air. Each cough, each ragged exhalation, seemed to bounce off the unseen walls, repeating itself in a mocking chorus. The full, monstrous scope of it settled upon me with crushing weight. Oakhaven wasn't just sick, it was being systematically devoured, its very essence siphoned away. My grandmother hadn't died of natural causes, he had fought, and ultimately, he had been overcome. The entity fed on memory, on individual consciousness. My grandmother's journal. It held the key. Her cryptic notes, her hurried sketches, her seemingly nonsensical observations, they weren't the ramblings of a paranoid old woman. They were a map, a desperate blueprint for survival. I remembered a recurring symbol, a strange, interlocking spiral, often accompanied by notations about resonance and disruption. I also recalled a specific mention of the old lighthouse, standing sentinel on the jagged cliffs overlooking the sea, and a peculiar kind of crystal he had been trying to acquire. He had been investigating something specific, something that could counteract the entity's pervasive influence. I pushed myself off the pillar, the tremor in my limbs giving way to a nascent determination. My escape had been narrow, a hair's breadth from oblivion. I was shaken, yes, but no longer lost. The true horror of Oakhaven was laid bare, and with it, a desperate, terrifying path forward. The fog swirled around me, blurring the edges of the concrete world, but in my mind, a plan, however desperate, began to sharpen into focus. The stillness had been a siren, soft and insidious, promising an end to the gnawing ache of loss, a balm for the terror that had become my constant companion. For a breath, I had almost surrendered. The thought had felt like cool water on a fevered brow, a deep, silent peace. But then, a flicker, my grandmother's eyes, not the vacant pools I now saw everywhere, but sharp with a knowing grief, alive with a stubborn light. It was enough. It was a spear point of memory, piercing the encroaching quiet. I shoved the tempting inertia from me, a physical exertion against an unseen weight. My hands clenched, knuckles white. There was no time for stillness, no room for surrender. My grandmother hadn't died for me to become another empty vessel. Her cryptic notes, her final, desperate struggle, demanded more. They demanded action. The streets of Oakhaven were hushed, draped in a perpetual twilight that seemed to absorb all sound. I walked with a frantic energy, my gaze sweeping over the familiar storefronts, now just facades behind which no true life stirred. The few figures I saw moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their faces smoothed of any emotion, their eyes glassy. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice too loud in the oppressive quiet, as I approached the shopkeeper, who was meticulously arranging tins of unidentifiable provisions on a shelf. His movements were precise, almost mechanical. "Do you remember the old lighthouse? The one your grandfather used to tell stories about?" The shopkeeper paused, his hand hovering over a dusty jar. For a fraction of a second, a tremor ran through his shoulders, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. A spark, barely perceptible, seemed to ignite deep within his eyes, like a dying ember catching a breath of air. He blinked slowly, and then the spark was gone, extinguished by the pervasive gray. His gaze met mine, utterly blank. "Lighthouse," he murmured, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "I only know what is here, now." He returned to his task, the rhythm of his hands unbroken. It was harder than I'd imagined, this fight against the encroaching tide. I tried again, seeking out the librarian, a woman who had once possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Oakhaven's forgotten lore. She sat behind her desk, staring at a closed book, its pages undisturbed. "The old oak tree," I pressed, my voice urgent, "the one where the town founders supposedly buried a time capsule. Do you remember the stories?" Her head tilted slightly, an almost imperceptible movement. She turned her gaze back to the unread book, her posture rigid. My desperation mounted. Each encounter was a hammer blow, chipping away at my resolve. They were gone, truly gone, or so deeply buried that only a miracle could reach them. Yet, the fleeting tremors, those tiny sparks of recognition, were enough. They were a sign that the entity hadn't fully assimilated them, not yet. There was still a thread, however frayed, to pull. I needed clarity, a weapon beyond my own failing memories. I needed my grandmother's journal. Its pages hummed with her frantic search, her desperate warnings. It was the only guide I had left. My hurried steps led me away from the hushed town center, past the skeletal remains of forgotten homes, until I reached the edge of the industrial district. The echoes seemed to multiply, creating phantom footsteps that trailed behind me, then alongside me, then ahead, a silent, unseen procession. I found a relatively secluded corner, tucked between two support columns, the air here even denser, pressing in on me. I pulled my grandmother's journal from my satchel, its worn leather cover a familiar comfort in my trembling hands. The small, focused beam of my flashlight cut through the mist, illuminating the frantic, elegant script. I flipped past pages filled with observations of the townsfolk's fading minds, past her increasingly desperate theories. Then, a section marked with a pressed, dried sprig of rosemary, a symbol of remembrance. It is not the memories themselves it consumes, but the act of remembering, the vital current that flows between past and present. Oakhaven is its chalice, its roots deep in the collective unconscious. I scanned further, my fingers tracing the faded ink. The heart of it lies where the first seed of memory was planted, where the town truly began. Not the physical ground, but the story that birthed us. The founding ritual, the first collective act of remembering. It was a promise made to the land, woven with the threads of shared experience. A relic. A touchstone of that initial promise. It holds the key. The entity fears its own origin, the moment before the great forgetting began. To remember collectively, with a focused intent, at the point of genesis. This is the only way to disrupt its silent digestion. A relic. A touchstone of an initial promise. The founding ritual. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of old tales I'd dismissed as folklore. The old oak tree, the time capsule. The lighthouse stories. It wasn't a physical weapon, but a weapon of the mind, of the past. The echoes of my breath seemed to stretch, drawing out into a low, guttural hum that resonated from the very concrete around me. It knew. It sensed my discovery, my fragile thread of hope. But the fear was no longer paralyzing. It was a fuel. My grandmother had left me a path. The clock was not ticking, it was already silent. I had to restart it. The entity fed on the ancient covenant, the pact etched into the very soil of Oakhaven. It fed on the slow erosion of that promise, the gradual decay of individual memory, replacing vibrant truth with a dull, collective hum. I felt it now, a cold certainty solidifying in my gut, urging me forward. The time capsule, the lighthouse, grandmother's cryptic warnings, they were all threads leading to this singular, terrible truth. My heavy boots crunched on loose gravel as I pushed open the rusted door, the groan of protesting metal echoing too long in the cavernous space. I had followed the last of the fractured paths, the whisper of a forgotten trail that led beneath the town's silent streets. The air here was a clammy shroud, thick with the metallic tang of damp concrete and the faint, unsettling scent of ozone. Mist, like a living thing, coiled around the structural pillars, obscuring the far reaches of the vast space. Every scuff, every shift of weight, seemed to multiply, creating a phantom procession that trailed just behind me, just out of sight. The ramp spiraled downwards, a dizzying descent into the earth's maw. The air became heavier, a palpable pressure against my eardrums, and the metallic tang intensified, laced now with something else, a deep, earthy musk, like damp soil and decaying leaves, but underlaid with a sickly sweetness, like overripe fruit. I reached the lowest level, the concrete floor giving way to a rough-hewn tunnel, its walls slick with moisture. The fog here was absolute, a milky white curtain that pressed in from all sides. It was a sound that was felt more than heard, a pulse. The entity. The tunnel opened into a vast, unholy chamber. And there it was. Not a creature of flesh and blood, not in the way I understood it, but a colossal, undulating mass that filled the cavernous space. I could feel the individual memories, not as distinct images, but as tiny, agitated motes of energy, flitting within the luminous depths of the entity, each one a stolen spark. It was the collective consciousness of Oakhaven, distilled and consumed. A wave of profound grief washed over me, not my own, but an echo from the entity itself, a vast, empty longing. It wasn't malicious, not truly. It was simply hungry. It responded not with words, but with a surge. My mind reeled as a torrent of images slammed into me. Not Oakhaven's memories, not yet, but my own. My grandmother's face, vibrant and full of life, her laughter ringing in my ears. Then, in an instant, her eyes went blank, her smile frozen, her voice replaced by a flat, monotonous drone. My own childhood home, painted in vivid detail, suddenly became a featureless gray box. My name, Cole, echoed in my head, then fractured into meaningless syllables. It was trying to erase me, to assimilate me into its vast, silent consciousness. It sought to strip away the unique threads of my being, leaving only a blank slate to be filled with its own muted existence. I staggered, falling to my knees, the floor vibrating beneath me. My head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat against my temples. The entity was pulling at the edges of my identity, unraveling the very fabric of myself. I saw flashes of my life, vibrant and real, then watched in horror as they blurred, faded, became indistinct, like old photographs left in the sun. No. I wouldn't let it. I focused on a single memory, sharp and unyielding, the feel of my grandmother's hand in mine, gnarled and warm, as she pointed to the old oak tree, telling me stories of Oakhaven's true founding. Remember, Cole, his voice whispered in my mind, cutting through the entity's static. I conjured the image of the time capsule, the one she'd hinted at, the one holding the true, unadulterated history. It was a beacon, a defiant spark of individuality in the face of this crushing uniformity. They were mine. The entity recoiled slightly, its hum faltering, a ripple of unease passing through its glowing depths. It had never encountered such resistance, such an adamant refusal to be absorbed. It had only ever known the quiet surrender, the slow fade. This was the reckoning. A battle for the very soul of Oakhaven, and for my own. I would not forget. The world, for a long, shuddering moment, was a symphony of static and a crushing weight that threatened to flatten the very marrow of my bones. Then, with a sudden, violent snap, it was gone. The immense, silent pressure that had squeezed the air from Oakhaven, that had muffled every individual thought and feeling, simply ceased. The air, thick with the smell of stale exhaust and standing water, tasted of iron and something else, something metallic and raw, like a freshly opened wound in the fabric of reality. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a phantom echo of the titanic struggle I just waged not with flesh, but with an ancient, hungry void. I was still Cole asterisk, I was sure of it, but the edges of myself felt frayed, softened. The fog, a permanent resident of this subterranean space, clung to the fluorescent tubes above, diffusing their sickly yellow glow into an indistinct haze. It swallowed the distant rumble of the town above, leaving only the drip-drip-drip of condensation from unseen pipes and the unnerving, extended resonance of my own breathing. I pushed myself upright, my limbs stiff, my muscles protesting. There was no other sound. No distant car door, no muffled conversation, no sign of life beyond my own struggling existence. It was the aftermath, not the imposition. When I finally emerged from the echoing maw of the garage, blinking against the muted daylight, Oakhaven lay before me, not transformed, but broken. The sky was still a bruised gray, and the familiar old buildings stood, seemingly untouched, but the life that pulsed within them was irrevocably altered. The pervasive, blank uniformity that had gripped the townsfolk was gone. In its place, a different kind of chaos reigned. A shopkeeper stood outside his hardware store, his hands trembling as he stared at a display of rusted tools, his face a mask of profound confusion. Further down the street, a young mother clutched her child, not with the protective, unseeing grip I had witnessed before, but with a desperate, questioning tenderness. Tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow, but of a bewildering sadness, as if he was seeing her child for the first time, and parts of their shared history were irrevocably missing. I saw a colleague, a man who had worked with my grandmother for decades, standing in the middle of the street, staring at his own reflection in a puddle. His eyes held a flicker of recognition, but it was quickly eclipsed by an expression of profound bewilderment, as though he was a stranger in his own skin. It was a victory, I realized, but a terrible one. My desperate act, the conjuring of the time capsule as a beacon of individuality, had been a shattering blow to the entity. I had not merely pushed back, I had detonated something within its vast, consuming consciousness. The ancient entity, I now understood, had not been destroyed, not entirely. But its grip, its insidious weaving of Oakhaven into a single, silent mind, had been violently disrupted. The collective memory, the very essence of its sustenance, had been fragmented, scattered like dust. Some memories, the most resilient, the most deeply ingrained, seemed to be returning, but they came with a profound sense of loss, like finding a treasured photograph with half the faces torn away. Others were gone forever, leaving behind not emptiness, but a phantom ache, a ghost limb of the mind. It was the sound of 1,000 minds struggling to reform, a desperate chorus of fragmented thoughts, forgotten names, and lost loves. It was Oakhaven, trying to remember itself, and failing, beautifully, tragically. The entity was disrupted, yes, but it had left behind a town of traumatized, amnesiac souls, forever scarred by the near erasure of their collective being. A heavy, profound choice settled upon me, weighing me down more than any physical burden. I could stay. I could try to help piece together the fragments, to guide these broken people, to rebuild a community from the shattered remnants of what had been. The thought was a painful pull, a sense of responsibility rooted in the very act that had brought Oakhaven to this state. Or I could leave. The fear that I, too, might be subtly changed, forever carrying the imprint of the entity's touch, was a cold whisper in my mind. Oakhaven, once a vibrant tapestry of lives, was now a tattered cloth, riddled with holes.